I'm currently on a sabbatical year here in Ushuaia. So I'm here for the year to do research on tourism to Antarctica. And Ethel has been kind enough to invite me to come to talk a little bit about US culture. So since Sunday is St. Patrick's Day, we decided that we would talk about St. Patrick's Day. But today we're going to talk about US culture and how it's celebrated through St. Patrick's Day, which is, has a lot to do with Ireland, but is not the same as how it's celebrated in Ireland at all. Right? The US has a very specific way of going about this. So St. Patrick's Day is March 17th, and it's a big celebration in the United States. In fact, this is my hometown of Chicago, and Chicago on March 17th dyes its river green. They actually put vegetable dye in the river to make the whole river green. It's a thing they've done for many years now. So this is one of the ways that people celebrate St. Patrick's Day. So let's talk about first who St. Patrick is. Have any of you heard of St. Patrick? San Patricio?
Yes.
Yeah? What do you know about St. Patrick?
No, the celebration.
Just the celebration, okay. About the saint himself?
The saint, no.
Okay. So he was the patron saint of Ireland, right? He was born in Roman Britain and then went to Ireland. He lived, circa means he was born around that year, but we're not sure of the exact date. So he lived in the 4th and 5th centuries. And he is credited with, first of all, converting the Irish, or the people in Ireland, to Christianity. He's also credited with using the shamrock to explain the Trinity. So the Christian Trinity, right, is God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. And so he compared this to the shamrock that has 3 leaves in one plant, right? Which is why the shamrock shows up a lot in St. Patrick's Day celebrations. And he's also credited with driving snakes out of Ireland, although I'm not sure there's any evidence there were snakes in Ireland, but this is part of the mythology that surrounds him. And he died on March 17th, which is why this is his saint day. Questions so far? You can interrupt at any point.
Okay.
All right. So St. Patrick's Day in the United States celebrates the Irish in the United States. The Irish are a large migrant population into the United States. We'll talk a little bit about how that came to be. It's celebrated by everyone, right? Although it is a saint, a Catholic saint, this is not really seen as a Catholic ceremony. It's not really seen as a religious celebration. It's a celebration about being Irish. We joke that in the US, on March 17th, everyone is Irish, right? So even people who are not Irish participate in this. In the US, we only really celebrate 2 saints' days. Guess what the other one is?
Valentine's?
Yeah, St. Valentine's Day on February 14th. And again, that's also not really seen as a religious holiday. Now, Catholics do celebrate saints' days, but it's not widely celebrated. Okay. And this is not an official holiday, so you don't get a day off school or off work. People still do everything they're doing, and they also celebrate this. So even though there's parades and other events going on, it's not like Thanksgiving where you actually get a day off work. Still doing okay?
Okay.
So what do you do to celebrate St. Patrick's Day? You wear green. If you don't wear green, people get to pinch you. Yeah, Sunday I'll be wearing green. We're a little early. But there's a tradition if somebody's not wearing green, you can go up and pinch them because they're not wearing green. There's parades in a lot of US cities, especially New York and Boston. And then there's a lot of food traditions that come up around St. Patrick's Day. Guinness beer is one of them because Guinness is brewed in Ireland. Corned beef. Corned beef actually is beef that's been salted, so it has nothing to do with maize or grains. You use big grains of salt to preserve the meat, and it has a particular flavor to it, so it's called corned beef. People dye food and beer green. So there's all sorts of like green cupcakes, green cakes, like everything turns green for St. Patrick's Day. As you'll see on this, like, you know, Starbucks, for example, will make like green frappuccinos, and there's green donuts, and it can be a little over the top, right? But here in the center, you'll see what's sort of seen as the traditional meal for St. Patrick's Day, which is corned beef with cabbage, and a really important thing for Irish food customs now, potatoes, right? So we have all these foods, but then we also have the potato, right? What do potatoes have to do with Ireland? No?
It's for the weather.
For the weather, yeah. Yeah, definitely potatoes were grown a lot in Ireland. In fact, a lot of my students in the US, if I ask them where potatoes are from, they'll tell me they're from Ireland, right? You guys know where potatoes were really domesticated, right? Mm. Yeah, they were really domesticated in the Andes, right, in Bolivia and Peru, right, which is actually where I did my first research. So these are some of my photos from that time. But in US culture, potatoes have become very closely associated with Ireland, right, to the point where a lot of my students there don't actually know this. They don't know that potatoes are from Bolivia. Right? Okay, so our three big questions for today are, first of all, how did potatoes get to Ireland from the Andes, right? What was that process? Second, why are potatoes so important in Ireland, right? Why are they so associated with Irish food? And then third, what does all that have to do with St. Patrick's Day as it's celebrated in the US? Okay. Sound good? ¿Entendemos? Yeah, okay. You guys will stop me if I'm going too fast, right? I'm from Chicago, so the truth is, I talk very quickly when I'm not like paying attention, so you have to stop me if I start. Okay, so let's start with what's called, at least in English, the Columbian Exchange. This is a way of talking about the ways that food and people and diseases moved between the Americas, right, the Western Hemisphere, and Europe, Asia, and Africa after European arrival in the Americas, right? So when we look at sort of the big history of the world, Columbus was not the first European in America, and he certainly never really understood where he was, but his trips started a sort of integrated global system where we start to see things moving between these two halves of the world, right? So things like potatoes and chocolate and tomatoes go from the Americas to Europe, Asia, and Africa. And then there are things that come from Europe, Asia, and Africa to the New World, like coffee and rice and sugar, and of course a lot of diseases, right, which led to the massive decimation of indigenous people in the Americas. Right? Mm-hmm. So when we think about these movements of foods, of which potatoes were one, we have a very uneven history. So here it looks very neat, right? Things sort of move sort of around the same time, but in reality, things are moving at different times. Some things are adopted very quickly. So for example, chocolate, which was an elite and ritual drink in Mesoamerica, moves very quickly to Europe and keeps its status as an elite drink, right? So people in the French royal court and the Spanish royal court are drinking chocolate, and they're actually drinking it in a way very similar to how people in Mesoamerica were drinking it, right? It was not sweet, it was spiced with chilies or with spices, but not with sugar, right? And so we see chocolate move very, very quickly. When we look at the potato, we see kind of a different process, right? The potato, of course, was a very important staple in the Inca Empire and all through the Andes, right? And continues to be a major staple there. These are pictures of my my compadres in Bolivia. This child is now in college, so this is kind of, photo's a little old. But what happens when people start bringing this to Europe is that potatoes are part of the nightshade family. I actually don't know what that's called, but potatoes, tomatoes, peppers, tobacco, we're all in the same category family, right? Eggplants is what eggplants were in Europe. So when potatoes are brought to Europe, they're very similar to a nightshade plant that's an ornamental that's poisonous. And so Europeans looked at the potato, they looked at the leaves and the flowers, and they said, we know this plant, this is actually dangerous to eat, right? And so they were very like, we don't know if we want to eat this, right? So potatoes took a little bit longer to work their way into Europe. Whereas chocolate, everybody loves chocolate, right? So chocolate right now. Okay, so how do potatoes actually make it into European cuisine? Because now in Europe, of course, people eat a lot of potatoes, right? So what was this transition like? Well, first of all, potatoes were a very important part of Sammells, were a very important part of the Spanish colonial project, right? So when we look at Potosí, Bolivia, right, what's Potosí famous for? You know? What they were mining here? Have you been to Potosí? No? That's famous for? This is one of the largest silver mines in the Americas, right? So the Spanish were mining silver with indigenous labor. That indigenous labor was brought in through the MITA system, which is a kind of labor tax. And all those people were fed with potatoes, right? So when we think about all the wealth that Spain was taking out of the Americas from places like Potosí and back to Europe, right? A lot of this was basically underwritten by potatoes, right? That was what was feeding the people that were doing the mining, that were producing all this coinage and all this wealth. But when potatoes themselves come to Europe, right, they're met with suspicion. So what happens to sort of make the potatoes more useful? One of the big things that happens, actually, is war. So if we look at, for example, the 30 Years' War in Europe, which was in the 17th century, what we see is that, and we'll be reading, if you choose to do the whole course with me, we'll read a piece about this by McNeil. What happens is the potato, its advantages of the potato, allow for peasants and poor people to survive war, right? So when we look at sort of before this, what we see is that people are growing potatoes in small quantities, right? They have what's called a garden crop. You have a little bit of space for some potatoes by your house, right, to supplement all the other things you're growing. As a result of these kinds of conflicts, we see potatoes transform into something that you grow on a much larger scale, right, in order to support yourself. So, have you grown potatoes ever?
No.
No? Have you grown potatoes? What do we know about potatoes as a plant?
It has a white flower.
It does have a white flower, sometimes a purple flower. Yeah, it has a beautiful flower, actually. Okay. Where does it grow? What part do you eat, the plant?
The roots.
You eat the roots of the plant, right? So the potato, right, you have the roots of the plant, and then it grows up and it actually shades out the weeds around itself, right? So you have to weed it a lot at the beginning, but after that, the potato doesn't need a ton of labor after that. It's also very good in low water environments. It can do pretty well with less water. So what we see in these kinds of wars, right? You look at Europe. Europe is really good at wars. They have wars all the time. And yeah.
Lo voy a agregar en español.
Yeah.
Que la familia British, que fue una familia británica, no sé si sabes, después que enseñaba a los yaganes a cultivar y cada uno tenía su quinta, sobre todo papas. Sí.
Yeah, no, eso tiene mucho sentido porque en el momento que British estaba aquí, ya era el 1850, 30, por ahí.
69, por ahí.
Sí, en ese momento ya la papa estaba bien establecida en Europa como un cosa que todo el mundo sabía crecer. ¿Vale? Y algunas de las ventajas de que voy a hablar también ayudaban en ese caso. Pero en ese momento la papa no era tan establecida. Era una cosa muy nueva y la gente un poco sospechoso porque era parecida a esa otra planta que era venenosa. Y entonces ya tenía un poco de tiempo para que se empiecen a...
Hola, yo soy Almendra Celina Romano Remé.
Hay registros arqueológicos que encontraron cultivos en otros lugares como el de Gaia o en la Patagonia, porque transmitían cómo cultivarla y los yaganes se iban moviendo y iban haciendo sus propias
qué interesante, eso es muy interesante. Sí, ¿qué?
No. You go on.
Okay.
You go on.
No, eso es interesante, porque la papa tiene muchas ventajas como planta. ¿Ve? Entonces, no me sorprende, y eso es una cosa que la gente que son agricultores siempre están experimentando con otras plantas, siempre están buscando esa plantita, qué hace, qué va a sobrevivir. Entonces, que la gente encuentra una cosa que tiene mucha utilidad, bueno, que lo compartimos con otra gente y yeah, my own compadres in Bolivia were always asking me to bring plants to them. I'm like, I can't bring plants to you because I have to fly internationally and they don't allow you to do that. But they just wanted to see, like, you told us about this tree, let's see how that does here. Let's give it a whirl, right, and see if it works. But unfortunately, not possible. Okay, so 30 years war, right? You have these armies marauding across Europe. And what they would do, right, is, as you see here, these are all these troop movements. They would, of course, if you have a big army, you have to feed your army, right? So they would go into these rural communities where people had wheat. And with wheat, you have to harvest it all at once. You thresh your wheat, and then you store it in a silo. And these armies would come in and they would take everything. And they would give them a piece of paper saying they would pay them back, right? Which means basically that your people will starve, right? So what happens with potatoes? Potatoes, you can leave them in the ground for a few months. You don't have to harvest them all at once, right? And so when that army comes through and says, give us all your food, you can say, well, it's in the field. Go ahead. You can harvest it yourself, right? Which means that those armies wouldn't take everything. So McNeil makes the argument that where you see potato production expand in exactly the communities that are hardest hit by these marauding armies, because they realize that this is something that's going to help them survive, right? That if they keep relying on wheat, they're going to keep losing all their harvests to these groups. But if they have potatoes, they can store them in the ground and they're going to be a little bit better off, right? So we see because of this conflict, the potato expands in Europe, right? Because it's a useful crop. It's also very useful because in terms of calories per acre, right, how much food can you produce with a unit of land, potatoes win hands down, right? So you can make a lot more food from a unit with potatoes than you can if you plant it with wheat or any other kind of crop, right? So if you don't have very much land, potatoes are really your best bet. And we'll come back to that. So how did this situation play out in Ireland specifically, right? We looked at the 30 Years' War, that's happening in like what's today Germany, France, Poland, all those areas. But what's happening in Ireland? It turns out the potato also had advantages for the Irish in terms of surviving English colonization, right? So if we look at the history of Oliver Cromwell, for example, who he was part of the English Civil War, right? He became Lord Protector of England in the 1650s after this conquest of Ireland, right? He led a major invasion of Ireland and basically made Ireland into an English colony, right? When we think about Britain, we often think about British colonialism in places like Africa and India, but Ireland was first. It was the first colony of England, right? So when Cromwell comes into Ireland, there's, first of all, the invasion itself was horrific, right? The war causes famine. There's a bubonic plague outbreak, and the Irish population drops, depending on how you estimate it, between 15 and 50%. So maybe up to half of people in Ireland die as a result of Cromwell's invasion. Hard to tell, maybe only 15%, but a lot. And about 50,000 people are sold as indentured laborers to be sent out to the US and the Caribbean, right? So there's this really sort of brutal conquest of Ireland, and as a result of that, what you see here is that there's also a shift in land ownership. So before Cromwell invades Ireland, most of the land is held by Irish and Catholic wealthy landholders, right? After his invasion, a lot of that land is transferred to English and Protestant families. And this becomes the religious division, becomes like the major divide in England between Catholic and Protestant, right? Which is always kind of interesting from a US point of view because we don't feel that in current society as much, but certainly in England it's still a big sort of divide. Okay. So before Cromwell invaded, the Irish diet relied a lot on barley, oats, rye, so grains. Wheat was consumed on special occasions. There was a lot of dairy products. So people had cows for milk and butter and cheese, and meat was offered a few times, was consumed a few times a week. Okay. What we see after this transformation in landholding is that the diet shifts towards potatoes. Right? Now, why is that? Well, what happens here is you have these English landholders who are pushing Irish people to live on smaller and smaller plots of land. And again, if you don't have much land, then potatoes are going to produce a lot more food, right, for your people, right? So they start switching towards potatoes to the point where many families would have like an acre of potatoes, which is like 4,000 square meters, right, and a cow. And that would be sufficient to keep the family alive. All right. Now, potatoes have lots of benefits. I'm a big fan of potatoes, right? But what's one of the disadvantages of potatoes? When you plant a potato, what are you planting?
The potato,
You're
the
planting
root.
the root, right? So what's the relationship between the plant that grew that and the plant that grows from it? It's a clone, right? So basically, if you're planting a potato, right, you're planting a clone of the original plant, right? And if you have, you can actually grow potato seeds. Potatoes do put out seeds, but it takes longer. You have to do another season to get it to a point where that plant will produce tubers that you can plant. So people don't tend to plant seeds, right? You can do it. But that means if you start with a small number of potatoes, eventually you're going to have a lot of one kind of plant. And that means it's very susceptible to disease, right? Because if a disease comes in and affects a plant, and there's no genetic diversity, then all those plants are affected the same way, right? Whereas if you're planting seeds, those plants will all be a little bit different, and a lot of them may die, but some of them may survive, right? But with potatoes, that's not the case. So Ireland went through several potato blights, right? Where diseases came in and affected all the potatoes that were growing, right? And this actually happened several times in Ireland and in the rest of Europe. But the most famous of these is called the Great Potato Famine, which happened in 1845 to 1851. And so the Irish potato famine actually becomes a hugely important event, not only for Ireland, but also for the United States, right? Because it was as a result of this massive famine that a lot of Irish migrants left Ireland and came to the United States, and why St. Patrick's Day became so important in the US because they were there, right? And because that was part of their identity. Okay. So when we look at the Irish potato famine, right, and these are actually drawings from newspapers at the time this was happening, right? So these are contemporary representations of the Irish potato famine. It caused a massive sort of disruption of the population, massive death, obviously. At least 1.5 million people died, and another million emigrated, right? And they came to the United States. A lot of them came to Argentina. A lot of them went to other places in the world. But we also have a lot of people from rural areas going into cities in Ireland, right? Which caused outbreaks of epidemics like typhoid and cholera and dysentery and other diseases. Now, when we think of the Irish potato famine, it's easy to think of this as just a disease that affects potatoes, right? But actually, the potato famine, this blight, this disease on potatoes, was going all through Europe, right? It affected potatoes in Germany and Russia, and there were famines there as well. But only Ireland was hit, suffered as much, right? All these other places had problems and there was famine, but Ireland was particularly hard hit. And the reason for that is political, right? So because you have this very unequal society between English landholders and Irish peasants, right? For example, it was very common for people to be evicted from their land. So people would be unable to pay rent on the land they were using to feed themselves, and so their English landlords would kick them out. And then, for example, people would come in and try to get all the potatoes they could off their land before the landlord showed up, basically, right? So you have a problem where it's not just that there isn't enough food, because actually there was enough food. It was about the fact that people couldn't afford it. So you have, for example, all through the Irish potato famine, Ireland continues to export food to England. They export beef, they export wheat, right? And they're doing this as people are starving to death in Ireland, right? Because rich landholders continue to make cattle and make money off of that, but the people who are poor can't afford to buy the food they need to live, right? And the English government did not act in a concerted way to try to solve that problem, right? So there are many people who will talk about the Irish potato famine as a genocide, right? That this was a deliberate attempt to destroy Irish people. Now, that's a debate we could get into, but just to point out that that argument is there.
No, pero ¿en qué año llega el Papa a Estados Unidos cuando la época de la invasión inglesa?
Bueno, eso los ingleses invadieron a Irlanda en 1649. Eso pasó en 1845. Pero había como 16 famines pequeños antes de eso. Eso solamente fue la más grande. Entonces, en la historia vemos que cada tantos años hay un problema con la papa y la gente muere, pero eso fue lo más grande. ¿Eso fue la pregunta?
Sí,
Okay, and another part of English responses to the Irish potato famine was that the English government really had a very poor opinion of Irish people, right? And so you would see in the newspapers, for example, at this time, them saying, well, if they're hungry, they should work harder, right? They should earn more money, right? Or they're only hungry because they're lazy and they're not working hard enough, right? So we see this sort of rhetoric, right, that about sort of blaming the poor for their own situation coming out, and that sort of reinforced English ideas, right, about not assisting these people as they should. So if we look at the sort of results of the Irish potato famine, right, the Great Potato Famine, we see that for large parts of Ireland, there's actually a decrease in population resulting from this, right, from both death, but also emigration, right, people leaving the country. You'll notice in the northern part of the country, which today is part of Great Britain, and what's much more Protestant, you see less decline in population, right? That's the political border between Protestant and Catholic, and who got more government support to sort of address the issue, right? And again, numbers are hard when you look at history because you don't have like a really clear census that shows you exactly how many people were there, so estimates will vary. But again, it's about 1.5 million people left, and about 1 million died. And if we look at the US, hang on, there's people leaving for the US, not those. You see, right, this is Ireland. Okay, Ireland right here, right? Sorry, this graph is a little hard to read. But this would be right around the time of the potato famine, right? So a lot of the immigration coming into the US at that time is from Ireland, right? And later on we have a shift in demographics and we start to see other kinds of people coming in, right? So when we look at the history of migration from the US, it's by country, it's varied a lot over time. But at that particular time, most of the population is coming from Ireland and then Germany. In fact, at this time, for example, the US does not have an official language, right? This surprises people sometimes. We don't actually have an official language. When they tried to have they tried to impose an official language, but there was a big argument about whether it should be English or German, and they decided just not to do it. So that was, you know, just to give a sense of like how much migration from Europe has affected the US. You know, we weren't always, and even now, you know, the country will publish government information in multiple languages. Because, you know, if you're in an area where a lot of people speak, you know, Spanish or Mandarin or whatever, the government publishes information in those languages for you, right? Because there's no official language.
¿Entendí bien? Los Estados Unidos no tiene una lengua oficial.
No tiene una lengua oficial. De facto es inglés, pero la verdad no tenemos, nunca hemos tenido.
Pero hay políticas, no sé, como acá, por ejemplo, que hay, la lengua oficial es el español y hay políticas como para que, o hubo políticas para que se difunda el idioma español.
Bueno, políticas tal vez, pero nunca había una ley que dice que inglés es oficial. Entonces, por ejemplo, las escuelas ahora la mayoría funcionan en inglés. Pero si tú vas para votar y estás en un lugar donde mucha gente habla español o hablan mandarina, el gobierno va a publicar esa información en esas lenguas. Entonces, no tienes que hablar inglés para hacer para nada. ¿No es?
¿Y lengua del pueblo originario?
Sí, eso es una buena pregunta. Hay lenguas originarias en los Estados Unidos, hay muchos, la verdad. Generalmente la gente que lo habla son la gente de esos grupos. No hay política como Bolivia que insiste que todos los demás lo hablan también. Sí, eso no existe. Sí, es un poco diferente que la gente siempre piensa que inglés es nuestra lengua y efectivamente es, pero oficialmente no.
And what about schools?
Generally schools operate in English, but depending on where you are, there may also be like classes in other languages as well. But yeah, generally public schools operate in English. So yeah, it's a bit different. Okay. So because all of these Irish people came to the United States in such a large group at this time, and continue to come in smaller numbers after that, what you see is that a lot of people in the United States identify as Irish or have Irish ancestors, right? So about 10% of people in the US identify with being Irish, or they're Irish American. A lot of other people also identify as having Irish ancestors, right? So this is something that's pretty common for people in the US to sort of feel like and this history, for example, especially on the East Coast, is taught to school children. This is actually a memorial in Ireland, but there are also memorials in Boston and other places to the victims of this famine, right? So this is a very commonly known piece of history for US citizens. Okay. So St. Patrick's Day really comes to the US with these Irish immigrants, but because these are people who have left their home, it takes on a very different meaning, right? So in Ireland, St. Patrick's Day is much more of a religious holiday. It's celebrated with different kinds of foods, right? It's a different kind of celebration. In the US, this is really about sort of the Irish coming to the United States. So the very first celebration of St. Patrick's Day actually takes place in the Spanish colony of Florida. But this is kind of an exception, but just to show you how early people are thinking about St. Patrick's in what is today the United States. But the first celebration of St. Patrick's Day in what's now the US was actually held by Irish Protestants in Boston, right? And 1737 is before the US Revolution, right? So the US declares independence in 1776. So this is a good 40 years before that. So even before we were a country, we were celebrating St. Patrick's Day and the Irish in the United States. By the mid-19th century, right, what we have is that this is a very established celebration. It's celebrated in many cities with parades. And it starts to be celebrated by groups that are also helping refugees from the potato famine adjust to life in the United States. Right? So as people are coming in, this celebration gets strengthened, right, as a part of sort of celebrating who you are in this new place. And since 1991, March is now Irish American Heritage Month, so that's what we do. Tomorrow is the New York St. Patrick's Day Parade. I don't know if it will be on TV, but this has been an annual event since 1762, again, before the US was actually founded. And as you can see, you have a lot of groups performing Irish music. You have a whole band of bagpipes there, right? So celebrating Irish music and dance. You also have a lot of people wearing green, people dressed up as leprechauns, right? Everyone wears green. Right? The New York Parade is really one of the biggest. And you have the traditional St. Patrick's Day meal, which is again corned beef, potatoes, and cabbage, and Guinness beer, if that's your. Okay. Any questions from you guys or thoughts?
Interesting, the relationship between food and celebration and religion.
Exactly, yeah. And corned beef was something that people in Ireland were making to export to England, right? Apparently in Ireland, they don't eat corned beef. I think they eat bacon or other kinds of meat. But corned beef in the US is also something that emerges in New York in various other immigrant groups, right? So part of this is about the Irish and their other non-Irish neighbors in the US, right? That corned beef is.
¿En Irlanda tiene la misma representación que tiene en Estados Unidos?
No creo.
Es más religioso.
Es más religioso, comen otro tipo de comida. Sí, es diferente, es muy diferente. Así que los irlandeses están un poco como, piensan que yo creo, bueno, no quiero hablar por los irlandeses, pero me parece que piensan que exageramos un poco, ¿no? Pero tiene otro significado, ¿no? Para ellos están en su país, en su santo, pero para nosotros tiene toda esa historia de por qué la gente ha venido a los Estados Unidos. Y muchos han venido en situaciones muy difíciles. Entonces, otro tipo de significado.
El sueño americano.
Yeah. In many ways, the Irish were, they were one of the first immigrant groups to really live what in the US is called the rags to riches story, right? Rags are ropa que está sucio, roto, right? Hasta el lujo. The people came with nothing and were able to, over a few generations, build themselves up into. And part of these celebrations also were showing non-Irish people that the Irish had that wealth and the respectability and and culture and all these kinds of things that sometimes people didn't think they had because they were. So yeah, absolutely.
y ahí vamos a mostrar Nueva York, New York. Pero ¿es la más importante o es la que más?
Es el más grande y el más antiguo, pero hay entradas en todos los Estados Unidos. And there's some where they're in small towns, but they've been doing them a really long time. Most Irish immigrants came to the northeastern part of the U.S. But for example, there's a parade in Georgia that's been going for a long time. Yeah, so yeah, New York is the biggest, but it's certainly not the only one. Boston has a huge parade as well.
Respecto a eso, no.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know what the difference is in how they celebrate St. Patrick's Day. They are the northern part of Ireland is part of Great Britain, whereas the rest of Ireland is an independent nation. Yeah, it's complicated, and there was a lot of conflict there in the 80s. There was a lot of violence surrounding that division. But in terms of my plays out for St. Patrick's Day, I'm not really sure. But it's a good question. So if you've registered, the course will send you all this.
Yeah.
And if you decide you'd like to do that, then there's 3 readings. They're not too long, and one of them is a modest proposal.
Famous one.
Yeah. Okay, so the modest. I want to warn you about a modest proposal because when you read it, it sounds awful.
Yeah.
Like the sky is just totally evil. It's actually the first example of satire in the English language. So. Jonathan Swift was a minister, high school priest, and he is. This was actually written before the Great Potato Famine, but during a smaller famine, and he is challenging his English compatriots to change how they think about the situation in Ireland. But he does it in a very, very unconventional way. So if you read it, it's a bit shocking. But try to see what he's trying to say under the sort of straight meaning, right? You have to read between the lines. It's a very famous piece, so it's worth reading. It's also very short. It's not very long, but it's
It's an essay.
It's an essay. It's maybe 4 pages. But just be warned. You have to sort of read it on the surface and then think about what it's actually saying. But one of the big sort of things to think about is when you look at a celebration like St. Patrick's Day, there's all this history behind it, right, that we don't see. And that even though potatoes, for example, are not domesticated in Ireland, they're still really central to the experience of the people there, right? And in some ways, we're central to their experience of being dispossessed from their land, right, and impoverished before they then were able to come to the United States, right? So.
Hoy que la fiesta esta no es oficial en Estados Unidos. Y por ejemplo, el Día de Acción de Gracias es oficial.
Sí.
Esa es la
Sí.
diferencia.
Día de Gracias es oficial. Eso fue hecho oficial después de la Guerra Civil. Entonces, en 1880 y pico, por ahí. Pero fue celebrado antes de eso. Pero si Día de Acción de Gracias siempre es jueves, todo el mundo casi tiene jueves y viernes libre, ¿no ve? Y muchas escuelas están toda la semana, ¿no ve? Entonces mi universidad cierra para toda la semana. La gente vuelve a sus casas y después vuelven a sus casas. Sí, entonces eso es oficial. Mientras el Día de San Patricio no es oficial. Entonces la gente tal vez van a trabajar y después van para celebrar con sus amigos, mucha gente va a los pubs, especialmente los pubs irlandeses. They drink beer, they have some corned beef. Sometimes everyone wears green, right? So it's much less formal. And for example, the parade in New York, I don't know if they always have it on Saturday. So this year, St. Patrick's Day is Sunday, but they're actually having a parade tomorrow. So I don't know if they move it so it's always on the weekend, so people have the day off and can attend. That's what they have. But yeah, it's not. Thanksgiving is the biggest holiday in the United States. Right? So this is not nearly as big.
They say thanks for sharing.
Thank you. If you have questions, send me an email.